They were praised as the strongest women of ancient Greece, free to speak in public, free to own land, free to train their bodies. Outsiders looked at Spartan women with awe, imagining a life of independence and pride. But behind this image of power was a night every young bride feared. A night where freedom ended and silence, pain, and submission began. Their hair cut away, their identities stripped, their first moments of marriage marked not by love but by terror. To understand Sparta's true story, we must ask, why did brides dread their wedding nights? Spartan women were admired across Greece for their freedom, but this freedom hid a secret fear. In the ancient world, visitors to Sparta often remarked with surprise that women there seemed to enjoy greater independence than in other Greek cities. They could own land, manage property, and were seen walking openly in public life. Compared to the tightly restricted lives of Athenian women, who rarely left the household and held little control over wealth, Spartan women appeared to be far stronger and more influential. This image created a reputation that has lasted for centuries, that Spartan women were unusually liberated for their time. But the public image told only part of the story. The truth of their private lives revealed a darker reality. While they might have controlled estates or spoken more openly in political matters, their personal relationships and intimate lives were heavily shaped by the state. Marriage was not centered on affection or choice but on the needs of a militaristic society that placed reproduction above personal happiness. Outsiders who saw Spartan women running estates or speaking boldly may have assumed they lived free lives. Yet behind this surface independence was a deep vulnerability. The greatest evidence of this hidden reality was the way Spartan brides faced their wedding nights. Rather than approaching marriage with excitement or joy, many dreaded it. For them, the wedding night was not the beginning of a shared partnership but the start of fear, pain, and submission. Accounts from ancient writers and modern studies suggest that this night was structured to establish dominance rather than intimacy. The paradox of Spartan women is that they looked powerful in public but were stripped of control in their most personal experiences. To answer why their wedding nights inspired such dread, we must first see what Sparta demanded of every citizen, male or female. In Sparta, even love and family were subordinate to the state. From birth to death, every aspect of life was measured against one central goal: to maintain a strong military society. Sparta believed survival depended on producing disciplined warriors who could defend the city against enemies and control the large population of enslaved helots. Because of this, the state claimed authority over both men and women, shaping their roles according to what would best serve the army. Children were not considered private possessions of their parents, but rather resources belonging to the state. Newborns were inspected by officials, and only those judged healthy were allowed to live. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and trained in the agoge, the strict educational and military program that defined Spartan culture. Girls were also shaped by this system, though in different ways. They were expected to grow strong and physically capable, not for personal benefit but so they could bear healthy sons who would one day become soldiers. Marriage itself was treated less as a bond between two people and more as a duty to the community. The state encouraged unions not on the basis of love or compatibility but on whether they could produce robust offspring. Family affection mattered less than the city's need for new warriors. Even the structure of weddings reflected this attitude, as rituals were designed to weaken individuality and emphasize the dominance of state priorities over personal desires. This constant subordination of private life to public duty created the framework in which Spartan brides faced their marriages. And this ideology shaped every step of a Spartan girl's life before she even reached marriageable age. Spartan girls were trained as rigorously as boys, but not for their own futures. From a young age, they were encouraged to run, wrestle, and strengthen their bodies, something unusual in the wider Greek world where women were expected to remain indoors. Outsiders often admired this practice, believing it gave Spartan women unusual power and health. Yet the purpose behind it was not to create independent women but to ensure that they could endure the demands of childbirth and produce strong sons for the state. Their training was less about personal development and more about preparing their bodies to serve Sparta's military needs. Beyond physical discipline, girls were conditioned socially to accept silence and endurance as marks of honor. They were praised for withstanding pain, avoiding complaints, and showing emotional control. The same values that made Spartan men endure military hardships were instilled in young women, but with a different end. Their duty was to suffer in silence during childbirth, in marriage, and in private struggles without resistance. In this way, the community shaped them into individuals who would not question or resist the roles forced upon them. What seemed to outsiders like a society that empowered women was, in fact, a system that reshaped them to serve the state quietly and obediently. Their freedom was limited to areas that benefited Sparta's goals, while their personal lives were tightly restricted. This balance of strength and silence created women who appeared powerful but were denied control over their most intimate experiences. But the real preparation for the dreaded wedding night began with a ritual that stripped them of their very identity. The first shock came with the shearing of the bride's hair. In Greek culture, hair carried deep symbolic meaning. Long hair was connected with youth, beauty, and femininity. For women, it was a visible marker of identity and pride, often associated with marriage and fertility. Cutting it short was not just a change of appearance. It represented the end of girlhood and, in many cases, humiliation. For a Spartan bride, this act was the first step in transforming her from an individual with her own sense of self into a figure reshaped by ritual and control. The shearing of the bride's hair worked as a deliberate tool of psychology. By removing the feature most associated with femininity, the ritual reminded her that her personal desires or identity no longer mattered. It was a symbolic breaking of pride and beauty, preparing her for the dominance she would face on her wedding night. What seemed like a simple physical change carried a heavy emotional weight. The young woman entered marriage not as herself, but as someone stripped of confidence and individuality. Writers from antiquity noted how unusual this practice was compared to other Greek cities. In Athens, brides were celebrated with adornments and symbols of fertility, but in Sparta the process began with loss. Instead of being honored, the bride was humbled. This reversal illustrates how deeply Sparta's customs prioritized control over comfort, shaping marriage not as a celebration but as a transition into obedience. And once stripped of her femininity, she was forced into a role that blurred her very identity. The bride was then dressed not as a woman, but as something she was not. After the ritual cutting of her hair, she was made to put on male clothing, often rough and ill-fitting. In a culture where clothing clearly marked gender and status, forcing a young woman to wear garments associated with men created deep psychological confusion. She had been stripped of her hair, the clearest sign of her femininity, and now even her appearance was reshaped to erase the boundaries of who she was. This was not meant to honor her but to humiliate her, reminding her that her role in marriage was not built on choice or dignity. The effect of cross-dressing went beyond discomfort. It disoriented the bride by making her appear less like a young woman beginning married life, and more like a figure caught between identities. She was presented not as a partner to her husband, but as an object to be subdued. Ancient observers outside Sparta remarked with surprise at such customs, noting how strange it was to see brides treated in this way. Where most Greek weddings emphasized beauty, fertility, and feminine honor, Sparta instead chose to disguise and diminish its women at the very moment they entered marriage. The ritual suggested that marriage was not about love but about conquest. By dressing the bride in male clothing, the state sent a clear message. She was no longer herself, but a figure molded to serve the needs of her husband and the society. The stripping away of her gendered identity was a preparation for submission. Yet this was only the beginning. The final hours before the groom arrived were designed to crush her spirit completely. A wedding night chamber in Sparta resembled a prison cell, not a celebration room. After the rituals of haircutting and cross-dressing, the bride was placed in a room that was deliberately stripped of comfort. Unlike other Greek traditions, where marriage ceremonies were filled with feasts, music, and decorated spaces, the Spartan bridal chamber was bare and oppressive. Darkness was its most striking feature. The room was kept unlit, creating an atmosphere of sensory deprivation that heightened fear and disorientation. The bride waited alone in this silence, cut off from the celebrations or support of family. Archaeological studies of Spartan domestic spaces have even noted traces that suggest the starkness of these rooms: minimal furnishings, hard surfaces, and, in some cases, markings on walls that may reflect distress or confinement. While the evidence is limited, such claims reinforce ancient accounts describing how different Spartan practices were from the rest of Greece. The bridal chamber was not a place of joy but of control, designed to weaken the bride's sense of safety before her husband even entered. The use of darkness served both symbolic and practical purposes. Symbolically, it erased the bride's individuality, reducing her to a shadow in the night. Practically, it heightened fear, as the unknown presence of the groom would soon invade the silence. Unlike the festive homes of Athens or Corinth, where brides were surrounded by family and ritual songs, the Spartan bride sat alone, waiting in a space that felt more like confinement than celebration. But what made this waiting period unbearable was not only the darkness, it was the knowledge of what was about to come. The Spartan groom entered his wedding night not as a partner, but as a warrior on a mission. Unlike men in most Greek cities, Spartan males did not grow up within the household. From the age of 7, they were taken into the agoge, the state's rigorous training program, where they lived among other boys and later young men. This system shaped them into disciplined soldiers, but also hardened them to view life through the lens of dominance and obedience. By the time they married, they had been conditioned to treat relationships not with tenderness but with the same authority expected in battle. Marriage often came late for Spartan men, as they were required to remain in military barracks until the age of 30. Brides, in contrast, were much younger, often between 16 and 18. This age gap placed them in deeply unequal positions, one a trained warrior at the height of physical strength, the other a young woman newly thrust into adulthood. Such an imbalance created a dynamic where the groom's role was not that of a companion but of an overseer, reinforcing the pattern of dominance that defined Spartan society. There were even small rituals that prepared the groom for this night. Wine was often used to loosen restraint, while aggressive exercises in military life had already trained him to act with force rather than gentleness. These customs meant that he entered the bridal chamber with the mindset of conquest, not companionship. What for other cultures might have been a moment of affection was in Sparta shaped into another display of control, reinforcing the groom's dominance over his young bride. And when he finally entered the chamber, it was not romance that awaited, but conquest. Accounts describe the wedding night in terms that today we would recognize as assault. Ancient sources, though often restrained in their language, give enough hints to reveal the dread surrounding this moment. The young bride, stripped of her identity through haircutting and cross-dressing, was left in darkness until the groom arrived. What followed was not a gentle union but an act designed to enforce submission. Writers speak of forceful consummation, and modern scholars interpret the descriptions as clear signs of violence. The screams and fear of the bride were not seen as tragic by Spartan society, but rather as part of the expected ritual of marriage. Consent played no role in this process. The girl, often still in her teens, was placed in a situation where resistance had no meaning. The much older husband, trained in the culture of dominance, asserted control in the most intimate way possible. For him, this was not primarily an act of affection but of establishing authority. For her, it was the moment when fear became the foundation of her married life. This brutal beginning served the broader goals of Sparta. By structuring marriage around fear and domination, the society reinforced the idea that family life, like military life, required submission to authority. Intimacy was secondary to the production of children who would serve the state. The wedding night was not about bonding two individuals, but about shaping the bride into her role as a silent, obedient partner whose body now belonged to Sparta's needs. To outsiders, the paradox remained. Spartan women looked strong in public, yet their private lives were defined by fear. The contrast between appearance and reality was sharpest on the very night that was supposed to mark a joyful beginning. But the nightmare did not end that night. It set the tone for the rest of married life. For many Spartan wives, marriage meant living with the enemy under their own roof. The wedding night was not simply a single traumatic event but the beginning of a lifelong struggle marked by fear, distance, and emotional isolation. Ancient accounts suggest that many brides withdrew into themselves after that night, showing symptoms we might now associate with trauma: silence, emotional detachment, and an inability to form trust with their husbands. The violence of their first encounter shaped the tone of their marriage, making affection nearly impossible. Even after marriage, husbands did not live permanently with their wives. Spartan men were bound to their barracks until the age of 30, meaning couples often met in secrecy and only briefly. This strange arrangement reinforced distance rather than closeness, leaving wives to manage households alone. While this gave them practical authority over property and estates, it also deepened the coldness of their marriages. Intimacy, already damaged by the traumatic beginning, had little chance to heal when husbands were physically absent and emotionally hardened by military life. For the wives, marriage became a condition of parallel living, managing estates on one side while enduring a distant, commanding husband on the other. The household never became a space of comfort or partnership, but remained an extension of the state's demands. Trust rarely had the chance to grow, and love was often a casualty of the system itself. And the suffering was compounded by what awaited them in motherhood. In Sparta, motherhood itself was an act of service to the military machine. A woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce strong sons who would grow into soldiers. Unlike in other Greek cities, where motherhood was tied to family honor or household continuity, in Sparta it was tied directly to the state. A mother's body became the instrument through which the city replenished its army. Every pregnancy, every birth, was treated less as a personal event and more as a public duty. The burden was immense. Sons were taken away at the age of 7 to enter the agoge, severing the maternal bond at an early stage. Mothers were expected to accept this separation without protest, for the city's survival supposedly outweighed private grief. Daughters, meanwhile, were destined to endure the same cycle of training, conditioning, and eventual submission that their mothers had suffered. Thus, every child carried the shadow of Sparta's system, and every mother lived with the knowledge that her offspring belonged more to the state than to her. This reality placed Spartan women under constant stress. Repeated childbirths, coupled with the ever-present risk of death in labor, made their lives physically exhausting. At the same time, the emotional toll of knowing their children were not truly theirs created a form of silent trauma. Their experiences of fear from the wedding night echoed into motherhood, where love had to coexist with loss and anxiety. The state might have praised Spartan mothers for their endurance, but behind the ideal of the mother of warriors was a life of sorrow and sacrifice. Their private suffering, though hidden, was inseparable from the functioning of the Spartan system. The private trauma of women had public consequences for Sparta itself. By traumatizing half its citizens, Sparta weakened its own foundations. While the system appeared strong on the surface, producing disciplined soldiers and feared armies, it carried hidden costs that eroded the very society it aimed to protect. One of the most severe consequences was high maternal and infant mortality. Women, pushed into repeated childbirth under harsh conditions, often suffered physically and emotionally. Many children did not survive infancy, leaving families fractured and the state constantly struggling to replenish its population. Households themselves were fragile. The emotional detachment built into Spartan marriages meant that family life lacked warmth and stability. Husbands and wives rarely formed close bonds, and children were raised more by the state than by their parents. This breakdown of family intimacy deprived the society of a vital source of trust and support. While other Greek cities cultivated traditions of household honor and personal legacy, Sparta invested only in its military machine, ignoring the damage done to private lives. The long-term effects were profound. A society that suppressed half its population's well-being could not sustain cultural growth or innovation. Spartan women may have held property and appeared powerful in public, but the trauma of their personal lives left little room for creativity or influence beyond survival. This narrowing of social energy contributed to Sparta's eventual decline, as it lacked the resilience and diversity of thought that stronger family bonds and freer individuals might have provided. By turning marriage into an act of fear, Sparta undermined the very community it claimed to strengthen. The cost of its military focus was borne not only by its soldiers but by its women, who lived in silence with wounds that never healed. So how should we understand this brutal tradition today? The story of Spartan brides is not just about the past, it is a warning for the present. Modern retellings often romanticize Spartan women as unusually free and empowered compared to their Athenian counterparts. They could own property, they spoke more openly in public, and they were admired for their physical strength. Yet this image hides the darker truth. Their private lives were marked by fear, control, and submission. The so-called freedom of Spartan women was not genuine autonomy, but a narrow role defined by the state's military needs. To admire them without acknowledging this reality is to repeat the myths that ancient Sparta itself crafted to mask its brutality. The real lesson lies in how Sparta weaponized the most intimate parts of human life. Marriage, childbirth, and motherhood, all experiences that should offer security and trust, were turned into tools of discipline and control. When a society treats relationships as instruments for power rather than bonds of care, it leaves scars that weaken its foundations. In Sparta, the scars appeared in broken families, traumatized women, and a hollowed culture that could produce soldiers but not stability. Modern parallels can be found whenever states, institutions, or even cultural systems intrude into private relationships and strip them of choice, respect, or dignity. Whether in forced marriages, systems that prioritize productivity over well-being, or environments where fear replaces trust, the warning of Sparta remains clear. No society thrives when love and intimacy are subordinated to power. The decline of Sparta shows that strength built on oppression is fragile. Military might could win battles, but it could not heal the silent wounds inside households. For a community to endure, it must be built not on fear but on dignity, trust, and mutual respect. Spartan brides remind us that without love and freedom, even the mightiest societies can collapse from within.